Have you ever stepped out in faith, made a big decision, or cast a bold vision, and then months or even years later, you're still waiting to see the results? You took the new role, you launched the initiative, you invested in your team, you did what you believe God was asking you to do, but the breakthrough you expected just hasn't shown up yet. If you've ever lived in that gap between promise and fulfillment, you're right where Abraham lived for a long time. In this second part of our series, Leading Through Uncertainty, we're looking at the promise delayed. We're going to see how Abraham navigated waiting seasons and what that means for you as a leader when progress is slow, when timelines are stretched and you're tempted to give up or force an outcome. Hey, friends, thanks for joining me today on Leading with Bill. I'm Bill Martin, your personal leadership coach, and this is where biblical wisdom can transform your leadership and life. Let's pick up Abraham's story after he's already obeyed and left his home. In Genesis 12, God promised to make him into a great nation. But time passes. Abraham and Sarah are still childless. The gap between what God promised and what Abraham sees keeps getting wider. And in Genesis 15, God brings Abraham outside and says, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." And then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." That's a powerful promise. And verse 6 says, Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham believes, he trusts, he leans in, but then more time passes. In Genesis 16, Sarah and Abram decide to help the promise along. Sarah gives her servant Hagar to Abram, and Hagar has a son named Ishmael. It's their attempt to create a solution instead of waiting on God's timing. Years later, in Genesis 17, God shows up again and reaffirms the covenant. He changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarah's, and specifically says the promised son will come through Sarah. And finally, in Genesis 21, after all the years of waiting, questions, and tension, Isaac is born. The promise is fulfilled, but it's on God's timing and not Abraham's. So Abraham's story isn't just about stepping out in faith. It's about staying in faith, even when the promise feels delayed. There are three leadership lessons I want to highlight from this waiting season. One, vision must outlast delays. God doesn't just give Abraham a one-time promise and then just disappear. No, he repeats and reaffirms it over time. Genesis 12, promise of a great nation. Genesis 15, stars in the sky, a visual reminder of the promise. And Genesis 17, covenant reaffirmed and new names given. So why does that matter? Because waiting wears on you. Delays drain your confidence. Silence can make you question if you heard right in the first place. As leaders, we need to revisit the vision regularly, especially when progress is slow. In your context, that might look like rereading your original mission statement, revisiting the reasons you started that project or took that role, reminding your team of the impact you're working toward, not just the tasks you're doing. If the vision is from God, it has to be strong enough to survive delays. Two, the danger of Ishmael solutions. Genesis 16 is one of the most human chapters in Abraham's story. Sarah essentially says, maybe this promise isn't going to happen the way we thought. Let's come up with a workaround. Hagar has Ishmael. It creates tension, pain, and complexity that ripple through the family. In leadership, we do our own version of this when we cut corners to hit a target, compromise values to get a quick win, or force a decision because we're just tired of waiting. We create Ishmael solutions, short-term fixes that create long-term problems. The leadership takeaway is not never act. It's this: don't let impatience drive you to choices that violate your values or your calling. Just because something is faster doesn't mean it's faithful. And 3, character formation in the waiting. In Genesis 17, before Isaac is born, God changes Abraham's name to Abraham. It means the father of many nations, and Sarah to Sarah. The promise hasn't been fulfilled yet, but God is shaping their identity in the waiting. Waiting seasons are rarely wasted seasons in God's hand. For you as a leader, the waiting might be where your humility deepens, your dependence on God grows, your motives, your resilience is developed. And we tend to focus on what we're waiting for. God, he focuses on who we're becoming while we wait. Let's connect this to faith and leadership in a practical way. Faith in waiting seasons, it's not just a feeling. I mean, it's a long-term trust in God's character, even when the timeline doesn't make sense. For Abraham, that meant continuing to walk with God, continuing to believe the promise, even when his circumstances didn't match it yet. And for you as a leader, faith in waiting seasons looks like staying anchored to the mission, even when the metrics are slower than you hoped, showing up with consistency, even when you don't feel inspired every day, or refusing to let discouragement dictate your decisions. And here's the leadership piece. Your team takes their cues from you. If you panic, they panic. If you quit, they lose hope. If you stay steady, honest about the challenges, but anchored in the mission, you give them permission to keep going too. Faith doesn't mean pretending everything is easy. It means choosing to trust God and stay aligned with your calling, even when it's not. Let's talk about how you can live this out in your leadership right now. 1, recast the vision regularly. If you're in a long-term project, a slow season of growth, or a drawn-out transition, build in rhythms to recast the vision. That might look like a monthly or quarterly meeting where you revisit the why behind what you're doing, sharing stories of small wins or lives impacted, even if the big numbers aren't there yet. Personally taking time in prayer or reflection to remember what God called you to in the first place. We've heard this said before, vision leaks. Waiting seasons can accelerate that leak. You have to keep refilling it. 2, set interim milestones and celebrate small wins. Abraham had the big promise of a son, but along the way, there were smaller moments of reassurance and progress. In your leadership, break the big goal into smaller milestones. Define what progress looks like this month or this quarter, not just in 3 years. Celebrate those small wins with your team. Recognize their effort, growth, and faithfulness, not just the final outcomes. This keeps morale up and reminds people that movement is happening, even if it's slower than you'd like. And 3 is guard against impatience-driven decisions. Before you make a big decision in a waiting season, ask yourself, is this aligned with our core values and our mission? Am I doing this because it's right? Because I'm tired of waiting? If I weren't feeling pressure or impatience, would I still make this choice? You might even invite a trusted mentor, coach, or a peer to speak into those decisions. Sometimes someone outside of your situation can see impatience creeping in more clearly than you can. The goal isn't to never act. The goal is to act from faith and wisdom, not from frustration. Abraham's story in the waiting years reminds us God's promises often come with longer timelines than we expect. Delays don't mean that God has forgotten. Waiting seasons can be some of the most important leadership formation seasons of your life. Abraham shows us that faith-filled leadership isn't just about stepping out once. It's about staying faithful, revisiting the vision, resisting shortcuts, and letting God shape your character while you wait. If this episode encouraged you, I'd love for you to like, subscribe, or share it with another leader who's in a waiting season right now. Friends, thanks for joining today on Leading with Bill. Remember, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and we'll see you next time.